Cartoons were a huge part of our childhood. And while they gave us some of the most iconic characters ever, some of those cartoons had hidden messages that, looking back, were way more questionable than we realized. From subtle stereotypes to straight-up dangerous ideas, here's a list of 10 of the most dangerous messages and dark secrets you missed in classic cartoons. And trust me, once you see them, you can't unsee them. At first glance, Tiny Toon Adventures seemed like a fun, modern take on the Looney Tunes formula. It followed young, energetic characters like Buster Bunny and Plucky Duck as they attended Acme University, training to become the next generation of cartoon icons. But beneath all the wacky antics and slapstick humor, there were moments that sent some seriously questionable messages to kids. One of the most infamous episodes, One Beer, featured Buster, Plucky, and Hampton experimenting with alcohol. What started as a humorous take on drinking quickly escalated as the trio got drunk, stole a police car, and ultimately drove off a cliff. Sure, the episode tried to frame it as a cautionary tale, but the comedic tone made it seem more like a joke than an actual warning. The fact that this aired on a children's network still baffles many. Beyond that, Tiny Toon Adventures regularly showcased reckless behavior, like characters using dynamite and pulling off dangerous stunts without real consequences. While slapstick was a staple of classic cartoons, this show often blurred the line between cartoon logic and real-world dangers. Many parents eventually took notice, but by then, the show had already left its mark on young audiences. And speaking of questionable messages, our next show took things even further. Animaniacs was a masterclass in blending chaotic humor with rapid-fire pop culture references. The Warner siblings, Yakko, Wakko, and Dot, delivered non-stop laughs, often at the expense of authority figures, celebrities, and even history itself. But what made this show stand out wasn't just its wacky antics. It was the sheer amount of adult humor that somehow made it past the censors. One of the most infamous moments came from the episode Hercule Yakko, a parody of detective stories. At one point, Yakko asks Dot to dust for Prince. She returns holding the musician Prince in her arms. When Yakko clarifies, no, fingerprints, Dot gives him an alarmed look and immediately drops Prince. The joke was so suggestive that even as an adult, you might do a double take. Then there were the segments featuring Minerva Mink, a character designed with such an over-the-top level of attractiveness that she spent most of her screen time either seducing or being seduced. Her episodes were so overtly suggestive that Minerva was quietly phased out from the show. While much of the humor went over kids' heads at the time, looking back, it's clear that Animaniacs snuck in some of the riskiest jokes ever seen in a children's cartoon. But if you thought innuendos were bad, wait until you hear about the violent and questionable messages lurking in the next video. For decades, Popeye the Sailor entertained audiences with his signature catchphrases, massive forearms, and of course, his undying love for spinach. But beneath its goofy charm and classic animation, this show sent one very clear message. Violence is the ultimate solution to every problem. Think about it. Whenever Popeye faced a challenge, whether it was Bluto trying to steal olive oil or any other antagonist standing in his way, he never tried diplomacy, reasoning, or even clever trickery. Instead, he just pounded a can of spinach and proceeded to beat the living daylights out of his enemies. It was the ultimate reinforcement of might makes right, teaching kids that brute force was the best way to deal with conflict. Sure, Popeye was always portrayed as the good guy and Bluto was often the aggressor, but there was very little in the way of nuanced problem solving. The formula was simple: get bullied, eat spinach, unleash a hurricane of punches. And let's be honest, how many kids actually went running for vegetables after watching Popeye? Probably fewer than the number who started throwing haymakers at their playground rivals. The show even had some questionable gender roles, with Olive Oyl being portrayed as a helpless damsel who needed constant saving. Popeye's overprotective nature and Bluto's creepy persistence reinforced some uncomfortable dynamics that definitely wouldn't fly in modern cartoons. But if Popeye's brand of cartoon violence felt a little old-fashioned, the next show on our list took it to wildly exaggerated extremes. Johnny Bravo was a staple of late 90s and early 2000s animation, but when you rewatch it today, you start to wonder, just how did this guy get his own show? The series followed Johnny, a muscle-bound Elvis wannabe with sunglasses and a ridiculously inflated ego, as he relentlessly hit on women, only to be shot down in increasingly humiliating ways. At first glance, it seemed like the show was making fun of Johnny's outdated, overly aggressive flirting. He was the butt of the joke, not the role model. But over time, the humor started reinforcing the very behavior it was mocking. Johnny's relentless pursuit of women, often with zero regard for their comfort, wasn't just played for laughs. It became his entire personality. Kids watching the show absorbed the idea that women were prizes to be chased, and rejection wasn't a sign to stop, but just parts of the game. Even worse, there were moments when Johnny's antics veered from harmless buffoonery into straight-up predatory behavior. He never took no for an answer, and in some episodes, he outright harassed women, grabbing their hands, sneaking up behind them, and even attempting forced kisses. While the show always ended with him getting his comeuppance, it didn't erase the fact that his behavior was played for comedic effect. And let's not forget how women were portrayed. Most female characters fell into one of two categories: gorgeous but cruel because they rejected Johnny, or ditzy and easily manipulated. The show reinforced gender stereotypes at every turn, painting men as clueless but persistent, and women as either trophies or airheads. Moving on, the next cartoon on our list took questionable content to a whole new level, with gross-out humor, violence, and surreal madness. If Johnny Bravo pushed the boundaries of acceptable humor, Ren and Stimpy blew past them at full speed, leaving a trail of nightmarish imagery, crude jokes, and unsettling themes in its wake. This Nickelodeon cartoon, which debuted in 1991, followed the misadventures of Ren, a psychotic, rage-filled chihuahua, and Stimpy, his dim-witted but lovable feline companion. On the surface, the show looked like a typical slapstick cartoon, but under that goofy exterior was a surreal fever dream of disturbing messages and grotesque humor. The show's over-the-top violence made Tom and Jerry look like Sesame Street. Ren regularly physically abused Stimpy, slapping, punching, and even threatening him with weapons. In one of the most infamous scenes, Ren fantasizes about sawing Stimpy's head in half with a handsaw, complete with eerie, whispered narration. And then there were the visuals. Ren and Stimpy pioneered a now iconic animation technique known as gross-ups, extreme close-ups of exaggerated, disgusting details. We're talking oozing sores, rotten teeth, and disturbingly detailed armpit hair. It was meant to be funny in a disgusting way, but it also made the show feel unnervingly unhinged. But perhaps the biggest issue with Ren and Stimpy was the questionable subtext in many episodes. The relationship between Ren and Stimpy often crossed into disturbing and inappropriate territory, with moments that hinted at an unhealthy power dynamic. Some scenes leaned into suggestive humor that definitely wasn't meant for kids, like an episode where Ren orders Stimpy to call him sir, while whipping his exposed butt with a towel. And let's not forget the real-life dark side of the show. Its creator, John Kricfalusi, was later exposed for deeply disturbing behavior, including alleged grooming of underage fans. With that knowledge, Ren and Stimpy becomes even harder to stomach. But while Ren and Stimpy was aggressively inappropriate, the next show on our list delivered its dangerous messages in a much sneakier way. The Flintstones, one of the first primetime animated shows, debuted in 1960 as a parody of The Honeymooners. And while its cheerful depiction of the prehistoric Flintstone family has made it a classic, there's a darker side when you look at its portrayal of gender roles, relationships, and social expectations. In the show, Fred Flintstone, the brash and overbearing husband, regularly belittles and bullies his wife, Wilma. While this was common in sitcoms of the time, it's a problematic theme that doesn't sit well with modern audiences. Fred often makes fun of Wilma for being overly emotional or incapable, reinforcing outdated gender norms. Another aspect that aged poorly is the show's treatment of minorities. The Flintstones occasionally portrayed racial stereotypes, especially through minor characters like the cavemen, who often displayed crude or unflattering characteristics. The lack of diversity and reliance on these tropes reflects the times in which it was created, but still raises eyebrows today. The show also often depicted excessive materialism, with Fred's constant obsession over gadgets and money, suggesting that consumerism and wealth were the ultimate goals. It's a message that might not be as wholesome as it initially seemed. Next up is a cartoon that had classic slapstick humor with some questionable undertones. Looney Tunes, home to iconic characters like Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Porky Pig, is a cornerstone of American animation. However, beneath the slapstick comedy and zany antics lies a deeper layer of questionable behavior and problematic themes. First off, there's Bugs Bunny's notorious ability to manipulate and outsmart others, often through deceit and trickery, something that's celebrated as clever but could be viewed as morally ambiguous. His repeated use of cross-dressing and sexual innuendos, especially in some of his interactions with female characters, can also be interpreted as inappropriate for children. Looney Tunes has also been criticized for its use of racial stereotypes, most famously in the character of Yankee Doodle Dandy, a racist portrayal of a black character during World War II. Characters like Elmer Fudd and Daffy Duck were frequently cast as comedic foils for their interactions with African American figures, revealing how mainstream media sometimes pushed racist ideas even in children's cartoons. Plus, who could forget the violence? Though it's exaggerated, Looney Tunes is packed with over-the-top antics. Characters get shot, hit with anvils, or even flattened like a pancake. While it's all in good fun, it's also an unsavory example of slapstick gone too far, especially when compared to more measured approaches in modern-day cartoons. Coming up next is a cartoon that was not as innocent as it seemed. At first glance, the Powerpuff Girls seems like a sweet and empowering show about three little girls who save the world. But look closer and you'll realize that it hides some deeper adult humor and questionable subtext. One of the most iconic elements of the show was the trio's fight against evil, but sometimes those bad guys weren't just villains. The villains' personalities and powers were often based on real-world stereotypes, with certain episodes exploring morally ambiguous characters that gave the show a darker, more complex tone than most other kids' cartoons. But the real kicker lies in the adult humor and innuendos peppered throughout. The Powerpuff Girls included references to things like relationships, alcohol, and adult fears, all of which were often hidden in the background or implied in dialogue. The show pushed boundaries with jokes that went over kids' heads but were unmistakable to anyone old enough to understand. Also, there's the fact that Blossom, Bubbles, and Buttercup were often portrayed as hypersexualized, especially in promotional material. While they were strong, independent girls, they were also frequently drawn with exaggerated proportions, highlighting an uncomfortable tension between empowerment and objectification. Let's take a look at our penultimate cartoon, a widely known animation which came with over-the-top violence and outdated stereotypes. Tom and Jerry is a cartoon that's beloved by many for its physical comedy and simple premise. The cat chases the mouse. However, the extreme violence in the show has always been a double-edged sword. While it's all slapstick, the level of violence is shocking by modern standards. Characters are constantly getting blown up, flattened, electrocuted, or clobbered by falling objects, all without any lasting consequences. This endless cycle of violence might seem harmless in a cartoon, but it paints a troubling picture about normalizing aggressive behavior. Moreover, some scenes teeter on the edge of being cruel, especially when Tom, the cat, is repeatedly abused for no reason other than to get a laugh. It's unsettling when you realize how much physical harm these characters endure without real consequences. But the darker side of Tom and Jerry goes beyond the slapstick. The show also featured racial stereotypes, especially in its portrayal of black characters. The most notorious example is Jungle Jerry, a 1940s episode that uses wildly offensive depictions of African culture. While this was sadly common in animation at the time, these offensive portrayals have made Tom and Jerry a symbol of outdated racial attitudes. This takes us to our final pick, a cartoon which hints at a darker meaning beneath its chaotic fun. Ed, Edd n Eddy was a cartoon that revolved around three socially awkward boys trying to make a quick buck, often by scamming the other kids in their neighborhood. But beneath its zany, chaotic surface, the show harbors a much darker subtext. First, the trio's constant failure to achieve their goals often led to humiliation, not just for them, but for the other kids too. The humor in the show often revolved around embarrassing situations or characters being dragged through difficult experiences. It was funny, sure, but there was something mean-spirited in the way the characters were treated. Some fans have argued that Ed, Edd n Eddy is actually a commentary on adolescence, depicting the harsh realities of growing up, dealing with insecurities, loneliness, and failure. The entire show is essentially about failing to fit in, with every character stuck in their own cycle of rejection. It was a lot more emotionally complex than most viewers realized, and definitely one of the more cynical cartoons to come out of the 90s. So there you have it, 10 of the dark secrets and dangerous messages of cartoons that you might have missed. Which of these cartoons do you remember watching? And which ones did you notice the hidden dark secrets they held? Let us know in the comments below. And if this trip down memory lane brought back some feelings, don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button for more nostalgic contents like this one. See you in the next video.